Welcome once again to our ongoing YouTube video series on technology, law, and business. My name is Christopher Neufeld of Neufeld Legal, and in this particular segment of videos, we are looking at technology contracts and the importance of those technology contracts. And in this particular YouTube video, we're going to be looking at a particular instance involving Apple that everybody knows, and the significance of having the right contract in place and actually pursuing a contract. Because there's an interesting story with Apple. Some of you might know it, but a lot of you probably don't. Now, everybody knows Steve Jobs as one of the co-founders of Apple. Probably also know of Steve Wozniak. Now, there actually was a third co-founder in Apple, and his name was Ronald Wayne. Now, Ronald Wayne was the gray-haired gentleman who the two Steves looked to have that kind of senior presence, the old stodgy guy who could just have that corporate presence that when they went to him, people were not so put off by these two upstart young tech entrepreneurs who in the early days of tech were a bit of a novelty. So Ron came in there, and for having this role of the old mentor, old gentleman who could calm down the corporate types, he was offered and given a 10% stake in the business. Yes, a 10% stake in Apple. Now, what's so interesting about Ronald Wayne is the fact that even though he got a 10% stake, he had his concerns about Apple. And for whatever fears that he had with tech companies and what was happening with them and the novelty of it, he had a fear that his own assets might be at risk, and that these two upstarts might cause him potential problems for his own personal assets. So even though he had been given a 10% stake in the business, he really didn't want that 10% stake because he thought he had too much liability and legal exposure from it. So what did he do? He said, I want you to take back my 10% stake. And what did they take back that 10% stake? You will not believe this. They paid him a whooping sum of $800 to take back that 10% stake in Apple. And to make sure everything was completely protected for Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, they paid him another $1,500 to forfeit any rights or any claims with respect to Apple going forward. So for a grand total of $2,300, and yes, it was back in 1970s money, he sold off his stake, his 10% stake in Apple. And he sold it off within 2 weeks of obtaining that stake. So why is this so important to contracts and the technology sphere? The reason it's so important, the reason we start off with that saga, is the fact that contracts allow you to do a whole range of things that allow you to legally protect yourself in a whole host of ways. Such that Ronald Wayne didn't necessarily need to give up his stake in Apple if he wanted to protect himself. Not at all. He could have contractually protected himself and thereby retained his stake in the business. And especially given the fact that Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak were driving forward, and these are internal documents, contracts typically, it is highly likely that they would not have been averse to what Ronald's concerns were, and actually said, fine, we'll structure you this deal. And even if it means giving a point back here or there, We'll structure an arrangement, put it down in contract. We'll take on the responsibility of this company. You can still retain your 10%. You continue to do your stuff. You don't even have to do anything really. And you could have continued to have a 10% stake in Apple. Like, who in this God's green earth would not want a 10% stake in Apple today? I don't think there's anybody out there who would not want that. But what do you need to be thinking of? Well, what you're thinking of is that in every technology arrangement that you do, whenever you're dealing with people, there are contracts available to you that can be designed to suit every single purpose that you almost want, so long as it's not illegal, and you can structure stuff. Get yourself a smart, knowledgeable, experienced lawyer who understands the tech industry, understands the internet and how it works, and understands business contracts, and you can structure pretty much everything. You can create for yourself those contracts that best advance your interests. And especially when somebody is wanting you, such as Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak were wanting Ronald Wayne to be an important component of their business. Yes, he has a 10% stake. And they were the ones who were taking on the responsibility. And he was a figurehead to deal with the other old people, the other people. Didn't really make much of a difference to them. You just got to know how to negotiate it and then get a contract in place that properly advances your interests. They wanted him. Yeah. You think they wouldn't have signed over a contract that would have provided him some protections because they were doing the brunt of the work? They knew what was happening and they knew what the risks were and the exposure they were creating? Very easily. Could have been done. Could have happened. But you know what? Ronald Wayne decided, I'm not going to touch this. Take back your shares. I did what I'm doing. I don't want to have exposure. Legal exposure can be mitigated. Legal exposure can be controlled. You can't eliminate it all. No, that's definitely not the case. But do you want to get rid of everything? Or do you want to do what's to your best advantage? And that is to contract with the other parties to put yourself in the position that you believe is appropriate for yourself. If somebody else is looking to push the business into taking on a considerable risk, well, you can protect yourself on that risk. Meanwhile, if you're going to be doing something innovative in the technology side, and you want to be compensated for it and you want to be aggressive in it, you can always get arrangements in that. People, especially in tech, are willing to pay and to contract for stuff that is to their advantage. Bringing in Ronald Wayne was to the advantage of Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. So they would have contracted appropriately to address these minor concerns, in my estimation. But what did Ronald Wayne do? He didn't try to contract. He didn't try to insulate himself and let them to do what they were doing. No. I want to get out of it. Take a little bit of money and don't go with the investment. And that's probably one of the major mistakes that somebody made. Hey, if he was well and good with it, that's all great for him. But that is what happens when you don't look to contracts and utilize contracts appropriately. I hope you have found this particular YouTube video informative. It gives you a new perspective on the history of Apple. It also gives you a perspective of why it's so important to look at your contracts and to have the right contracts in place and to pursue contracts for all sorts of business aspects. We hope you like this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and provide us with your comments. And we look forward to providing you more informative YouTube videos in the not too distant future. Thank you.